What's up, guys? Austin here, sports performance coach for Athletic Lab. Had a question on Instagram last week. What assessments do you use for incoming college athletes into performance training programs? So, first we'll start off why do we test athletes? So, for starters, we want to determine what the athletes need. In our case, a lot of times we're dealing with groups. You could also see individuals, so you want to determine what that individual or group needs to train during their tenure at your program. Another reason we test is to see if that athlete can meet the standards required by their team. So with a lot of our soccer athletes, you see the yo-yo test specifically with their college teams, and we need to be able to determine if they're going to be able to meet the standards of their team when they get to school there. And lastly, we need to test the efficacy of our training. So if we test in the beginning, we determine that the athlete needs to increase their power, try to increase power, and we don't see any improvements. Obviously, our training program's not working as we should, so we should make some changes moving forward. So we also want to test how well we're doing as coaches, see if we're getting the improvements that we'd like to see. As far as when do we test, obviously at the beginning of the training cycle, so we want to get a baseline measurement. And then you can test intermittently throughout, depending on how long you have your athletes. But we want to test at the end, again, to meet those criteria. Did we improve? Did we improve where we need to? And are we meeting the standards that we're hoping to reach at the beginning of our training program? So as far as testing batteries go, we have a system in place. It's not going to be the same for every athlete. Obviously, different sports are going to require different tests, and you're going to see different testing protocols based on individual training programs and group style training programs. But we have a system in place that's going to fit the needs of most athletes and make small alterations based on what the coach determines is relevant from there. So starting your testing battery, obviously we're going to get a solid warm-up plan in. You want to make sure we're keeping that standard. You have a 20-minute warm-up for your pre-test and a 5-minute shoddy warm-up at the end of your test. Obviously you can't say that your results are reliable. So we want to make sure we're keeping the warm-up there relatively standard. And then going into testing protocols, testing batteries, and the choices we use for all the different assessments. Going to start with, textbook test design. So starting with the tests that are least energetically demanding, least fatigue producing. Anthropometric would be starters, but we don't really use anthropometric tests here too frequently, especially with classes. It's not necessarily the most critical for performance development. So we'll start with our power test. Vertical jump is going to be the first thing we do almost every time. This is a valid and reliable test. It's going to be relevant for almost any athlete you see. Vertical jump test we use with Fusion Sport Jump Mat. Obviously, there's less technology demanding tests that you could use. You could just have your athletes stand up against a wall, mark the wall with tape or chalk. Obviously, outstretched arm so you can determine the displacement there from the pre-jump and after the jump is completed. So vertical jump is going to be essentially your gold standard for power development. And obviously for athletes that are seeing jumping in their sport frequently, track and field jumpers, basketball, volleyball, sports such as these, obviously going to be a very specific test as well. After the vertical, going into approach jump test. So still using the Fusion Sport Jump Mat, but again, there's less technology demanding tests that you can use. You can test the same way you test your vertical using chalk or tape on a wall, or Vertec if that's all you have available. Again, the approach is going to be a solid test for lower body power. You're adding a little bit of a technical and coordination component into it. There's also an increased eccentric component, moving your linear momentum into an upward lift. Again, these are going to be very specific for volleyball, basketball athletes, always moving in from an approach, but that does not mean that it's not a reliable or valid test for other athletes. Still demands coordination, still demands that eccentric component. So if you're seeing, you would expect to see pretty significant disparity between approach and vertical, with the approach being increased jump heights. So if you're not seeing a disparity there, I think you would definitely need to address those components of technical coordination and increased eccentric component in their training. Moving on from power development, lower body power, and jumping development, we're going to test our speed next. So we have 30-meter 30-meter dash time in here. Again, using technology that we have available to us using Fusion Sport gates. You can use a stopwatch here. Electronic timing gates are naturally going to be more accurate, more reliable. But I understand that not everybody has those available. So using a stopwatch, if that's all you have available, is a decent option. But again, technology is definitely going to be your go-to here. You might see pretty large disparities when you're using manual timing. It might be as far as a quarter second off, which at the end of the day could be 5% perhaps of the athlete's run time. So that might not be an ideal way to measure time. So a 30-meter test is a great test for speed. A lot of times you're going to be seeing athletes get at or near top speed around the 30 meter mark. So using the 20 and 30 meter split, we can analyze that. Obviously, just divide your 10 meters by the time of that split will give you a relative idea on the athlete's max speed, at least max speed in the 30 meter range. 30 meter test is going to be a solid test of lower body power as well as technical ability to accelerate, so accelerative speed, and again, getting into max speed there. You could use a longer sprint there if you're not limited by space. A 40 test would be just fine, but 9 times out of 10, 30 is going to get you the information you want. It's a nice standard to uphold, and it's going to give you a greater insight into accelerative power, which is more often than not a key factor when you're dealing with athletes of all sports, field and court sports, as well as track and field sports. Moving on from speed, we've got our change of direction test. So we use 5-10-5 here. There are obviously a ton of tests that you can use for change of direction and agility. I would be careful using the term agility here, because agility incorporates a lot more than just a physical component of change of direction. So we're gonna call this a change of direction test instead of agility. And the reason we prefer the 5-10-5 is because you are limiting the measure of top speed. So some other tests that you might see are going to be much more dependent on top speed. 5-10-5, we're seeing no longer than our 10 meter split. We have 3 change of directions or starts in there. So with a relatively constrained distance, we're seeing a ton of change of direction, a ton of reaction in there. So that's going to be our gold standard here for change of direction, not limited by max speed or anything. You get a good insight into that athlete's ability to start and stop repeatedly. Moving on, strength and power tests. So here's where we start to see a lot of disparity based on what are your athletes doing, what sports are they competing in, and what's their training age. So easy test, push-up, pull-up, not necessarily the most logistically possible. It's going to be really difficult to test 30 athletes at once for push-up, depending on how many coaches you have available. For younger athletes, push-up, pull-up is definitely a solid plan, but may not be as relevant for more experienced athletes at the collegiate setting. So aside from those body weight general strength measures, we can do max power. Again, we have an advantage here of having quite a bit of technology on our side. So we can use the push band for max power using a hex bar deadlift, combining a standard load, 63 kilos for men, 43 kilos for women, using push band to determine power outputs. Is going to give you a clear insight. Again, moving away from the speed and power we did earlier in the session, giving you an insight into strength power component of that athlete. So this is going to be great for football players, track and field, basketball, any sport where there's a significant strength and power component. And again, this is not something that can be easily replaced without technology. You can do power clean, but if your athletes don't have the training experience, that's probably not going to be a good time to test them while you're trying to teach a movement. So if the athlete is not already proficient in that movement, power clean, power snatch, whatever you want to use there, it's probably not a good time to use it. And you can stick with the vertical jump for these measures if that fits your constraints. Squat max is also a good one. Again, we have the push band, so it's going to be less physically demanding on the athlete. With the push band, never have to go over 80% load. This one's easy without technology, right? Standard 1RM test. Again, if the athlete has a very low training age, see a lot of incoming freshmen that do not necessarily have experience in the weight room. This might not be a relevant test. One, it's not going to be too useful for someone with a low training age. You would expect their squat max to increase after a month of training, so it's not going to be too relevant after that first month of training. And if they don't have the technical expertise, I would be hesitant to trust a 1RM test there. So each of those you can kind of pick and choose as you please depending on the athletes. Obviously you have older male football players. These tests might be a little bit more accurate than, say, a freshman female volleyball player. You kind of just got to pick and choose depending on your sports there. And finally, this is very specific for us, dealing with a lot of soccer athletes. We have a very specific soccer college prep group come in during the summer. So for our anaerobic energy systems test, we use the yo-yo intermittent test. This is quite specific for soccer athletes. They see this all the time in training as well as in their tryout settings. So when we have soccer athletes, collegiate soccer athletes come in over the summer, their teams are expecting a certain score on the yo-yo test when they show up to camp. So testing the yo-yo at the beginning of a training will tell us where our athletes sitting right now. Can they meet the standards of their test? Are they way off? Is this something that we need to dedicate a ton of time to? This cycle, we actually saw that our incoming athletes were not as prepared as we would like them to be for their school test, the intermittent yo-yo test. So we dedicated a ton of time to this. Not necessarily going to be as relevant if you're dealing with football or non-energetic demanding sports. So again, this is something that you need to determine if it's relevant for your athletes and determine if it's relevant for their sport. All right, that's a quick overview on what we do for our testing. Again, it's going to take a lot of subjective input from the coaches, but that's a lot of the tests that we use for our athletes. And again, a lot of it is weighted towards soccer athletes, but a lot of these tests are certainly universal. All jumping, speed, change of direction tests are going to be relevant for every single athlete. So this is a pretty good baseline to start from. Thanks for tuning in, guys.